of a quick overview for RRSPs, where they're really good for a VCC like eFund is the leverage. You get 4-to-1 leverage. So for every dollar you put in, you're getting back almost immediately 75 cents in tax breaks. So that really lets you stretch your dollars because you get back 50% of your money in tax savings. And then of course you get the 30% tax credit. So it's really better than 4-to-1. And that's the real nice thing about RRSPs. There are some issues around these, and that has to do with withdrawals. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment that might surprise you. Now with
lost your audio.
There we go. Then a TFSA, the big problem with TFSAs, they're wonderful. They're a perfect tax shelter, except of course we're limited to how much we can put in. If you've never had a TFSA, you can still open one up and contribute 81,000 after-tax dollars to it. Now I do know some people, some angel investors that have had very good luck using their TFSAs with public companies and other investments. And if you've got a couple $100,000 in your TFSA, as some of these people do, it's a wonderful vehicle to use. And one of the beauties of it is that you can take money out and then put it back in a subsequent year, which is something that you can't do with an RRSP. Now, this is what may surprise you. In terms of comparing a TFSA with an RRSP, the after-tax benefits are identical. Some people think that one is better than the other, but for a given tax bracket, and I've used 50% here just for simplicity, even though we know that our top marginal rate is now 53.5%, but doesn't matter, it always works out the same way. So you can see that with a TFSA, you're basically investing after-tax money, and then it grows and you cash in tax-free. And using an example of 12% return on an investment, which is what I hope our VCCs will achieve, at least as a minimum IRR over a long period of time. In this example, you have $4,800 of return after 20 years. With an RRSP, it's exactly the same. The difference is that you have more to invest, but then you have a huge tax hit when you take the money out. Now, where there's a big benefit with the RRSP is if you contribute at a high tax rate and then you withdraw at a lower tax rate. And of course, that's what the government was thinking about when the program was created many years ago. The idea is that when you're earning lots of money in your younger years, you have a high marginal rate. And then when you're retired and you no longer generate a lot of income from your profession, maybe you're down at a 30% or 40% tax rate. And in that case, you can see there's a huge, huge benefit in using an RRSP. As a general rule, what I would recommend is that you max out on all these shelters. It always distresses me a little bit when people haven't maxed out on all of their shelters. So you should, as a rule of thumb, contribute as much as you can to both of these shelters. Now, the one thing that we should also remember is that there is the lifetime capital gains exemption, which in 2021 was almost $900,000. And it too is almost identical to the benefits that you'll achieve with a TFSA or an RRSP. But the difference is the amount. And it's probably a good strategy to use your lifetime capital gains exemption funding or funds that you may have available to invest for private companies. This would not work in the case of a VCC because a VCC doesn't qualify as a private company. But if you co-invest with eFund, for example, in some of the investments that eFund is making, then it makes a lot of sense to use this and to use it over and above the others because you've got that huge lifetime allowance. And it's a good idea to take advantage of that before there are any tax changes that might result in the removal of that. Now, I want to quickly give you two actual examples that have happened quite recently that might give you some pause to think about using these vehicles. So we had a VCC for General Fusion that we started way back in the early 2000s. So here's an example where a colleague of mine, Bob, bought 100,000 shares using his RRSP, and that was a $25,000 RRSP investment. In 2020, the value of that had grown to $200,000. Now, in 2020, this went offside with qualifying for an RRSP. So it had to be withdrawn from the RRSP, and that meant a tax hit at the top marginal rate, resulting in $107,000. There were a number of investors in this VCC that didn't have the funds to pay for the taxes. And if they, let's say, did not remove this particular asset from their RRSP, they would be penalized by the government to the same degree. So no matter what they did, voluntary or otherwise, they'd have either a tax hit or a tax penalty of over $100,000. And this VCC had no liquidity. So it was a big headache for quite a number of people. And the only way we were able to solve the problem was to find some new investors that would buy these shares at a discounted value. The other example, and I'll use my wife for this one, she bought shares in 2010 for $10 a share. And when she hit the age of 71, she has to start withdrawing shares from the RRSP because RRSPs become RIFs, and you're obligated to take a certain percentage out each year. Now, in this case, it wasn't a particularly big headache, but nonetheless, she had a $4,000 tax hit, which she had to cover with other proceeds because, again, she was not in a position where she was able to get any liquidity by selling some of these shares to cover the tax liability. So these are two examples that you really do have to think about. So in terms of strategy and conclusion, when you use these shelters, it makes sense to use all of them. It's a good idea to prioritize the use of the lifetime gains exemption because it isn't as limiting as the others, but of course it doesn't work for a VCC, only for co-investing. And it makes a lot of sense to use an RRSP for your eFund investment, but also keep in mind that you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket. You want to make sure that these shelters are somewhat diversified, because if you have a failure in the shelter, for example, if you have an investment that failed in the TFSA, you can't replace that. So you're basically forfeiting future capital gains that you cannot shelter if you have a failure. As I mentioned with those examples, you may have a pretty substantial headache if you are forced into making withdrawals from an RRSP. It's not a problem withdrawing from a TFSA, no penalty at all, because there is no tax implication when you withdraw funds, but certainly is with an RRSP. So you can see that these two are very similar when it comes to the after-tax results, except that, as mentioned earlier, an RRSP is really, really good if you can withdraw at a lower marginal tax rate. So that said, I've got a couple of minutes here if anyone wants to share some examples or ask any questions.
Mike, it seems to me that the TFSA is a safer route, because these for private investments like VCCs or in Canadian controlled companies, because these are long-term investments, and with the TFSA you don't have to liquidate, right? So you don't have that liquidation penalty that Bob had that you mentioned.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I would max out my TFSA first, but that's my gut feel.
Yeah, the thing is, unless you've got a couple $100,000 in your TFSA, if you, let's say you started fresh today and you put $81,000 in and you invest that in one or two investments, and let's say those go south, then you've given up that potential tax benefit. You now have nothing in the TFSA. So that's something you want to be careful about. So you want to make sure that you have some diversification in these. I know a number of people that have used speculative public companies in their TFSA, and when those companies fail, there's no relief. You can't even use an able allowance or an offset against your other taxes. Whereas if you just use straight capital outside of a TFSA, at least if you invest in a private company and it fails, you can have an allowable business investment loss to mitigate some of that. But that disappears if you use a TFSA. So it's another thing you have to be cautious about.
Good. Any questions? Other questions for Mike? I think with regards to Bob's problem, it was solved because there was some liquidity from other investors, right? So we've had a few people who wanted to exit out of eFund, and other eFund'rs were able to purchase these shares. So some liquidity can solve a lot of problems, because it's terrible if you get a tax hit on a stock or an equity that's not liquid. So to have some liquidity in the market is great.
Yeah, you absolutely need that liquidity. So, when we invested in General Fusion back in the early 2000s, we thought, well, that's a long time. And certainly by the time you hit the age of 71, that liquidity is going to be there. But as we've seen with angel investing, sometimes there are no quick exits. Sometimes these exits can take 20 years. And if you're in that situation, especially if you have a good investment that's appreciated in value, that can definitely cause you some problems. It's okay if you have the cash to pay the tax bill, but there were a number of investors who, if we had not found buyers, would have had problems. And I don't know how they would have solved those problems.
Great. Okay, Mike, that's a great overview. Thank you very much. I'm sure that people can contact you if they've got any other questions. But it's pretty clear to me. And anything else from anyone on the call before we let Mike go to his next meeting? Oh, here's a question from Doug. Can the capital gains exception be used on US investments?
No, the lifetime capital gains exemption only applies to qualifying CCPCs, Canadian controlled private companies.
And only after.
And you have to, of course, be an investor in those companies for at least 2 years.
Yeah.
And if you use something like a SAFE, for example, that doesn't cut it. That won't qualify. So don't use safes. Never use safes. Regardless, tax shelters or otherwise, screw safes.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that.
Good. Thanks, Peter.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike.
For having me.
Awesome.
Yep.
Take care.
Take care. Yep. Bye-bye.